A lonely young woman meets her long-lost relatives, who reunite with her for a grand wedding. However, she finds herself trapped in a nightmarish tradition as she relishes her familial ties and succumbs to a nobleman's charm. During a stormy night in an English manor, a butler unlocks a room and urges a distressed woman to eat. Suddenly, she pushes the manservant aside with great strength and escapes. Fear-stricken, she ties a piano wire around her neck and grabs a bust statue in the hallway. The others learn about her escape and search the mansion's unending halls. When someone sees the lady sitting on the parapet, she jumps to her death as the statue accompanies her fall, and the string beheads her. The unknown woman's body dangles on the balcony, putting an end to her life's miseries. In New York, a struggling waitress, Evie Jackson, counts her earnings after a catering service. She jokes about the unconsented touches they've endured during the event with her friend Grace. Their boss overhears their conversation and tells them to be grateful for the job. Afterward, Grace hands Evie a gift bag from the event, which contains bottles of wine and a DNA kit. Then, they part ways as their shift ends. In her rundown apartment, Evie spends her night in solitude with her ceramic wheel and listens to her late mother's voice message for comfort. Frustrated with her craft, she picks up the gift bag and listens to the DNA test instructions on her laptop. Evie learns the results may find her distant relatives as she wistfully glances at her mother's pictures. Longing for familial support, she takes the test and mails her sample to the company. Days later, Evie hangs out with Grace and receives an email about her DNA results. Surprised, she discovers she has a British second cousin who invited her to meet. However, Grace doubts her friend's plan to see her long-lost relative. Nevertheless, the lonely caterer's curiosity about her distant family makes her accept the young man's invitation. That weekend, Evie meets her cousin, Oliver Alexander, at a lavish restaurant, who visited the city for work. He asks about her relationship status, and the young woman shares she's single, finishing a degree in arts while freelancing as a caterer. Then, Evie reveals that her parents passed away with her mother's recent death and expresses her desire to visit her ancestry in England. Overjoyed, Oliver tells his cousin about her great-grandmother Emmeline, who had an affair with a footman and raised Evie's grandfather alone. Right after, the curious caterer learns that Oliver blabbed about her to his clan and eagerly invites her to their cousin Martin's grand wedding. Surprised, Evie admits she can't afford a trip to England, but Oliver shrugs her concerns and offers to pay for her expenses. Her cousin is ecstatic about introducing her to the Alexander family, empathizing with her loss and telling her that she's not alone. Soon, Evie arrives at Whitby, Yorkshire, where Oliver fetches her from the airport. She learns that her long-lost family stays at the DeVilles, the bride's manor, until the wedding. Elated by the extravagant mansion, Evie arrives at New Carfax Abbey. She is about to inform Grace about her arrival when she accidentally bumps into a maid. As a service worker, she instantly helps the newly hired maids, Dia and Imogen, clean up the broken glass despite their protests. However, the head butler, Mr. Field, orders the maids to clear the mess quickly. Evie answers back at the irritable man when the lord of the manor, Walter DeVille, intrudes and dismisses Mr. Field. Walter apologizes on the butler's behalf and recognizes Evie from America. Then, Oliver introduces them to each other, surprising Evie when she learns she's casually speaking with the host. Walter appreciates the elegant vase she carries, one the peculiar guest personally crafted to gift the soon newlyweds. Later, Mr. Field escorts the esteemed guest to her bedroom. Inside the grand hall, Evie's eyes feasts on the authentic art pieces as she passes by an empty pedestal of a bust sculpture. Then, the butler introduces her to the lady's maid, Mrs. Swift, who hesitantly accepts Evie's handshake and leads her inside. Evie explores her lavish room and finds a matryoshka doll gifted by the bridesmaids to the guests. Suspiciously, she finds the windows barred, so Mrs. Swift explains they're to prevent carnivorous birds called shrikes from invading the mansion. Evie sees Walter outside as the maid shows her the service bell. Then, she sees a portrait of the former lady of the house who recently died, so the young woman empathizes with their loss. That night, Evie relishes her canopy bed on a call with Grace when a knock on the door interrupts. Walter greets his guest and apologizes once more for the incident earlier. Evie admits she was offended by the butler, so the lord assures her comfortable stay and expresses his interest in knowing her better. When they bid goodnight, Grace teases her friend, who exits the manor for a midnight jog. On a hazy night, Evie hears a creak from an isolated building in the woods. Ominously, she hears the dead lady's last words and sees her from the room. Suddenly, the horrified guest sees the unknown woman's decapitated head and jolts awake from her nightmare. In her dark room, she stares at the chair's silhouette up front and hears a sinister voice whisper her name. Evie sighs in relief as she opens her light and sees nothing unusual. Strolling to calm her nerves, the oblivious guest passes by the mark of the strings on the parapet. Then, she watches Mr. Field in the hall instructing the new maids to await their assignments. Concurrently, a sinister hand reaches Evie's shoulder, but when she turns, the empty hall greets her. Suddenly, Mrs. Swift appears and leads her back, saying that the help is attending their final rounds. The service bell from the library rings, so the butler leads the maid, Imogen, inside the locked room. Mr. Field chants outside the library while the maid lights some candles to illuminate the dark room. However, an unknown figure dashes by, extinguishing its flames, so Imogen lights them again. Then, the oblivious maid hears a creak and witnesses the candles cease once more. Suddenly, the gramophone starts, frightening Imogen. When she looks up, she sees a pair of villainous eyes and screams as it tackles her. The following day, Evie wakes up late and joins her newfound relatives in a reunion. She meets Uncle Julius, who addresses her as an Alexander. Then, Great Uncle Alfred traditionally taps his glass and introduces Evelyn to their all-male family. Longingly, Evie expresses her gratitude to her welcoming relatives. She recognizes Dia, who serves her delicacies. Oliver informs Evie that Walter is looking for her. Smitten, she makes sure they're not related, which her cousin confirms. Meanwhile, Mr. Field orders maids Dia and Anna to retrieve a bottle at the wine cellar upon the Lord's request. Displeased with the strange butler, the women head down to finish their task while Mr. Field chants as he walks away. In the dusty cellar, a hand brushes Dia, who assumes it is Anna. However, the frightened maid finds no one behind her and hears her companion beckon her to another room. While reaching for the bottle, something pulls Dia's hand, and she sees a silhouette behind her confused friend. The terrified maid backs away and witnesses the figure break Anna's neck. Then, another creature snarls at Dia, who screams in horror. In her room, Evie finds a gown given by Walter to wear for dinner. That night, she prepares for the event while on a call with Grace, filling her in about her teary relatives. Suddenly, a shrike charges on her closed window, which expires instantly, frightening Evie. Soon, Mr. Field announces the esteemed guest's arrival at the extravagant dinner in the garden. Oliver escorts her when the butler welcomes the maids of honor, Victoria Klopstock and Lucy Billington, who earn applause from the crowd. Evie finds that her cousin left her alone, so the bridesmaids approach her. Lucy welcomes her warmly, so Evie asks about the bride, Cecile, learning all their families are old friends. However, Victoria denigrates the newcomer, so the uncomfortable guest excuses herself. Afterward, Evie grabs another glass of champagne while Lucy follows her. The friendly woman shares that she wants to explore New York, so Evie offers to tour her. Then, the butler announces the arrival of the Lord, who immediately approaches his esteemed guest. Walter invites Evie for a dance, saying it's customary for him to lead it. Despite her protests, the aristocrat sways the young woman to the music while everyone watches. Meanwhile, Victoria irritably comments on Evie's accent to Oliver. He appreciates his cousin's charm, and the condescending woman congratulates him for finding a female Alexander to preserve their bloodline. On the dance floor, the host invites Evie to escape the gathering, which she willingly obliges. As they stroll the estate, the young woman hears a noise from the forest and asks if there are wolves in England. Walter laughs at her foolishness and clears that wolves aren't around for over 400 years. Then, Evie recognizes a sculpture dating back to the 17th century. She also asks about the isolated building in the woods, which Walter reveals as the Ice House. However, the aristocrat leads his guest into his workroom, and Evie eyes the ceramic wheel. She reveals that her late mother taught her the craft and learns that Walter is also orphaned. Getting better acquainted, Evie flatters the wealthy bachelor, who urges her to kiss him. As fireworks set off the night, the daring woman gives in to the Lord's temptations while Victoria observes them from outside. At midnight, Walter bids his guests a good night. Victoria confronts him spitefully about his love interest, so he warns her to leave Evie alone. Later, Evie awakes and sees the dead lady standing at the foot of her bed. She slowly reaches for the lamp, but an ominous whisper calls her name as she sees handprints on the canopy draw claws. Terrified, Evie accidentally knocks on her lamp and hides under the bed. Suddenly, she sees a sinister hand, and someone drags her out. The trembling woman sees Walter and tells him about the unknown creature. However, they discover the room is void of unusualness as the host opens the light. Walter comforts and assures Evie's safety as she gazes around warily. Soon after, the overwhelmed guest drinks tea to calm her nerves while Mrs. Swift cleans the mess. Then, Walter interrupts, dismisses Mrs. Swift, and offers to stay with Evie until she falls asleep. On the bed, the young man asks her about her life's desire. In reply, the struggling artist wants to live life fully, whereas Walter reveals that he longs for acceptance. The following day, Evie awakes with an empty bed and the Lord's letter beside her. Then, the bridesmaids enter and invite her to a spa. Evie follows behind and leaves her phone after assuring Grace's worries. At the salon, Lucy introduces Evie to other female guests and gets a manicure. The friendly woman asks her about her thoughts on marriage, but Evie immediately denies interest, which saddens Lucy. Then, Victoria probes the newcomer's relationship with Walter, asking if the Lord spilled anything about them. Evie recognizes her challenging tone and declines having curiosity about the man's past. Suddenly, Evie's finger gets cut and bleeds, which the arrogant woman teasingly sucks. Disturbed, the young woman leaves and declines Lucy's help. At the hall, Evie eyes the mysterious library and unlocks it with the hidden key Mr. Field used. Then, she accidentally knocks on a vase and finds her printed profile and DNA results, insinuating that the host had been searching about her beforehand. In Infuriated, Evie packs up her stuff when Walter enters her room. The young man worries that Victoria said something she shouldn't, but Evie hands him the paper she found and calls him a stalker. Walter explains that he only wants to know about the stranger before welcoming her into his household. Evie insists that he could have asked her, so the Lord apologizes and expresses his desire to know her deeply. Beguiled by his sincerity, Evie leans to Walter's touch and surrenders her bare self, leading to a steamy afternoon. Later, the head of the manor indirectly proposes marriage to Evie, which she jokingly accepts. Then, he tells her to prepare for the rehearsal dinner, and she obliges, excited to meet the couple to be wed. That night, Evie attends the masquerade dinner late, wearing a crimson gown, and sits beside Walter at the head of the long table. Shortly after, the lord of the manor formally greets the three families, Alexanders, Klopstocks, and Billingtons. Walter savors his lover's beauty as she asks about the bride and groom's whereabouts. Euphoric, the aristocrat taps his glass and delivers a monologue about the four families' tainted union. To rectify their bond, Walter announces his upcoming union with the sole living female Alexander, Evelyn. While the families cheer, Walter calls for refreshments, and a maid enters with a bowl. Unexpectedly, Mr. Field slits the ignorant woman's throat from behind as her blood pours into the glass. Horrified, Evie sees Lucy and Victoria bare fangs in delight and realizes their true nature as vampires. Afterward, Walter continues his narrative, revealing that the three mortal families have been respectively providing him with brides in exchange for their prosperity. Their rare bloodlines immunize the vampires from the passing of time, rendering their eternal union vital. Since his former Alexander bride, Emmeline, Evie's great-grandmother and haunting ghost, betrayed him and committed the unthinkable, their bond wavered. Unfortunately for Evie, Oliver found and offered her into their nightmarish tradition. Then, the centuries-old host toasts to his new wife-to-be. Paralyzed by fear, Evie watches Walter drink the glass of blood with his other wives. The new bride fearfully heads towards the door, but the butlers block her. She begs them to help and release her while Mrs. Swift looks at her with guilt. Walter calmly addresses his bride's behavior as she calls the bystanders as monsters and pounds at the door. Then, the fiery vampire threatens his bride and demands his wives prepare Evie for their wedding. Soon after, the butlers uncover Evie in the dungeon, who's tied to a chair. Victoria and Lucy reveal they're friends with her great-grandmother, but Emmeline refused to hurt people. Evie realizes that Victoria, the first wife, was the one who visited her room. Comfortingly, Lucy says she'll gain immense power and youthfulness after drinking their master's blood at the ceremony. Suddenly, Dia charges at her perpetrators, but her shackles stop her. Evie pretends to have taken a liking to the maid, so they prepare her for the wedding. Afterward, Victoria locks Evie in a coffin as Lucy looks at her in worry. The following day, Mrs. Swift, her great-grandmother's friend, frees the vampire's bride from her cage and tells her to send help. The old maid reveals that a stake, beheading, or fire will kill the monsters, and she pushes her away. Then, the service bells ring all together as they discover Evie missing. The young woman runs into the ice house and discovers the bodies of dead maids. Evie hides under a table as Mr. Field enters, carrying Mrs. Swift's body. The butler sees the bride, but she quickly exits and locks him inside. That night, Evie arrives at a nearby town and begs an old woman, Mina Harker, to let her in. She pours the trembling woman tea while her husband Jonathan phones for help. Then, Evie sees an old picture of the couple in front of New Carfax Abbey, suggesting their loyalty to the powerful family. Knowing this, the young woman tries to escape, but Mina immediately knocks her out. The next day, the captured bride wakes in front of Dia and Walter, who play the gramophone and reveal himself as the ancient Romanian vampire Dracula. He entices the young woman about the power and wealth she'll gain for eternity, but Evie spits at him, refusing his offers. Then, Walter silences the maid by drinking her blood, nauseating the bride unconscious. Soon after, great-uncle Alfred leads his great-niece down the aisle beside her groom affront their guests. The officiant takes their vows when Evie remembers Emmeline's final words and her mother's message. As the bride accepts her fate, Walter slits himself and offers his blood to the defiant woman. Evie eagerly feasts on the vampire, and his powers transform her into his kind. Afterward, the drained vampire reaches to consume his wife, but Evie sets the altar on fire and thrusts a stake into his heart. She glares at Oliver, who brought her into this mess, and sets Dia free. Into the Great Hall, Victoria pursues the escapees and fights the vampire's new wife. Dia stops the first wife from clawing Evie and exits to call for help. Then, Lucy enters and slashes her friend, guilt-stricken from their sins. Enraged, Victoria attacks the traitor, but Lucy pushes her and accidentally impales them with the statue's stake. Evie witnesses the two women disintegrate into dust when Mr. Field attacks her. However, the halfling uses her power to break his spear and stab his neck, killing him instantly. Then, the frail vampire catches Evie and strangles her, but she uses a wire to cut his arm and push him into the fire. Consequently, Evie's power recedes as Walter perishes, so she watches the manor engulf in flames with the ancient monster. Soon after, Evie stalks her cousin Oliver as he plans to escape. Together with Grace, they charge into the cunning man's sanctuary to finish him them off.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.